Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful Davis Center event with Professor Maxim Shrayer. My name is Sergei Kan. I'm a professor of anthropology at Dartmouth College and also affiliate of Russian and Jewish studies at Dartmouth and of the Davis Center. Professor Maxim Shrayer was born and raised in Moscow, immigrated here over 30 years ago. He's a bilingual author, scholar, and translator. He's a professor of Russian, English, and Jewish studies at Boston College. He also serves as director of the project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry at Harvard's Davis Center. He authored and edited over 20 books in English and Russian, among them the internationally acclaimed memoirs, Leaving Russia, A Jewish Story, and also Waiting for America, A Story of Immigration, the double biography Bunin and Nabokov, History of Rivalry, which I just finished reading. The Holocaust Study, I Saw It, Ilya Sylvinsky and the Legacy of Bearing Witness to the Shoah, and the Travelogue, With or Without You, The Prospect of Jews in Today's Russia. He edited and co-translated 4 books of fiction by his father, the Jewish Russian writer David Shrayer Petrov. Maxim won a 2007 National Jewish Book Award, and in 2012, he received a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship. His Voices of Jewish Russian Literature, published in 2018, a very important source for many of us. And he will be reading from and discussing his most recent creation, a wonderful book of poetry in English, called Of Politics and Pandemics, Songs of a Russian Immigrant. And I just want to add, I finished the book and it speaks in many voices. It's a really multivocal kind of creation. It is an American academic speaking, but also a Russian Jewish immigrant. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for turning this rather miserable time that we're all living through, the pandemic, into a source of inspiration. Although I'm reminded, of course, of a famous poet who used his quarantine during cholera to write wonderful poetry. And I'm thinking now of Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. Not that I'm comparing Maxim with Pushkin, but nonetheless. So anyway, I'll turn over to our speaker today and look forward to the talk. We'll have time for questions to Maxim and answers, comments afterwards.
Thank you so much and good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Kan. Thank you, Sergei, for this wonderful introduction, for which I'm grateful. And I also would like to thank all our colleagues at the Davis Center for making this possible. And of course, all of you for joining us. I was just thinking that on a miserable day like this, in the midst of the pandemic, it's almost difficult not to think heretical thoughts about the beneficence of what we're living through. Because I can well imagine that if we had a live event, not many would turn up, despite what Sergei presented as my fame and acclaim for which I too am very grateful. It's a very generous introduction. But now here we are speaking across the Facebook waves and across continents. So that's really, really wonderful. So I am very happy to speak about this little book of politics and pandemics, Songs of a Russian Immigrant. And let me just show you my research assistant, Stella, who is very much in the book. And now Stella is going to leave, and I will rejoin you in a second. And what I'm going to do first is, because I'm going to read a longer piece and a few shorter pieces. The longer piece, which is the prologue, in a way explains how this book came about and also explains its voice, that of a Russian immigrant. So I'm just going to make a couple of prefatory comments in prose. I'll start with a couple of questions which in a sense anticipate how I wrote this book. Why is our country going through such a terrible patch of history? Is the world on the brink of an epidemiological catastrophe? Those cursed Dostoevskian questions were very much on my mind between December 2019 and May 2020 as I composed a series of English language poems. mainly focused on the election year politics and the COVID-19 pandemic. A Jewish Russian immigrant for more than 3 decades, I had lived with, or perhaps within, a language gap. What do I mean by that? While English had taken over as the language of prose, Russian had retained the special status of the language of poetry, and then it all quickly changed. So the question is why and how? First of all, at the end of 2019, I very much remember experiencing a surge of political hopelessness. There was this gripping sense of despondency and angst, and I think it spontaneously found expression in English language satirical verse. However, as my teacher, my father, David Shrayer Petrov, who is both a writer and a medical doctor, likes to say, life made its own arrangements. So with COVID-19 holding us all captive, by the end of March of 2019, I was writing mainly about the pandemic. Life, as you remember, quickly retreated and turned inward under the yoke of the deadly virus. And so my poems became less satirical, I suppose, and more lyrical. And so by the summer of this year, I had found myself with almost 40 poems. These poems are set in Boston and on Cape Cod, and they chronicle the way politics and pandemics erode the fabric of our society. So I was very happy that a Boston-based publisher agreed to release the book in time for the presidential election. So it's been out just a little bit over a week. And there you have you. And with your permission, I'm going to read first one longer text, and then a few shorter ones. And I just want to say one other thing. So one can think of the poems in the book as being political satire and more lyrical reflections on the pandemic. I think there is a third way of thinking about these poems or grouping them together. A number of these poems, and I discovered this, it wasn't necessarily deliberate, are in conversation with some of my favorite Russian authors and also with my Jewish Russian immigrant past. And so what I've done is for today, I've chosen some of the poems specifically to highlight some of the Russian and Soviet themes. So the first one is Prologue, A Russian Immigrant Meets His Double. And this poem harkens back to a tradition of poetry, originally Italian, written in terza rima, but this tradition is still very much alive in contemporary Russian poetry. And with that in mind, I will begin. We used to live on Beacon Street in Brookline. The year of the election was underway, and all the different contenders looked like caricatures of virtue and dismay, and yet I chose the ones I could contend with, as long as they succeeded, come what may, in beating the trump and rescuing our tender democracy from a looming right-wing threat. I knew our freedom needed a defender. I didn't know how this theatrical election could be so dull. And when I felt fed up with all the rest, I usually took our silver miniature poodle for walks in a secluded old park. We'd stroll around the circle and I would doodle with words and rhymes. And later I would park them on my desktop as though silly verses could offer solace and also hit the mark of truthfulness and justice universal, or simply paint a picture of spring eternal. The vernal season wasn't far ahead. The body shunned the chill and craved the sunny, languorous days, the honey of New England. On my long walks, I would observe a skinny, bespectacled fellow with a Newfoundland, old and piebald. When the weather wasn't rainy, they occupied a bench, near the sandbox where the children built their castles. The owner read, the dog lay on the ground. For weeks, I walked my poodle around the circle without ever speaking to the man who seemed withdrawn or even antisocial, who owned a dog too weak to join the clan of other dogs, careening or escaping from their owners who knew not where they ran. And yet I wondered, what if this is fated? What if he is also a Russian immigrant, my own double, conjured up, created to help me shape these lines into a rant against tyranny, indifference, injustice, against cruelty, contempt, intolerance? Thus I envisaged. When he came from Russia, he brought with him a puppy, now 14. He's outlived his age and broken records. An immigrant dog the world has never seen. I thought the owner lived in Moscow or Saratov, then immigrated at the age of 37 and settled in one of Boston's near suburbs where streets and parks resound with Russian verbs. Meanwhile, the Ides of March augured disaster. The crown prince of death had crossed the Styx and from the underworld returned to spread death faster than doctors could invent a medical fix. The Trump was useless. Congress dragged its feet and I forgot about politics. The living life retreated. The quarantine ruled over Boston. Zoom became our window into the world. Imagine my esteem for frozen spinach and for canned tomato. We homeschooled the kids. My wife saved lives. I taught remotely at night. I tried to veto the hours of Netflix. Then I realized that in pandemics, arguments like mine rang hollow, appeared oversized, especially to a keening teenage mind. I tinkered with some writing, nothing lofty. I watched old Soviet movies to unwind. I read my favorite poets, Zabolotsky, Akhmatova, Sylvinsky, Pasternak. I went outside. When the New England sky bled colors of sunset, I headed for the park where the dog owners maintained their social distance, whereas the dogs refused to stay apart. My immigrant double kept his old place beside the sandbox, now cordoned off. He sat, a pad in hand. The Newfoundland was dozing at his feet. Sure enough, his memory was filled with greener pastures. The immigrant dog was tired of life. I wondered as my restless silver poodle was pulling at her leash and urging me to make my move, to seek out my double. A gust of wind went through a willow tree. I straightened my mask and slowly approached. Please note the haunting symmetry. 2 immigrants, 2 dogs. I finally broached the subject indirectly with a nod. Excuse me, and I don't mean to encroach upon your privacy. Don't you find it odd that we've been bumping into one another without ever sharing a word of conversation? I was wondering where in Russia you came from. My good double looked askance at me, then turned his gaze in the direction of sunset and replied, his Slavic accent not very strong, yet tangible. My old home has been renamed, or unrenamed to be exact. St. Petersburg, I guessed. St. Isaac's Dome. Yes, he confirmed, and countless other beauties. I love your dog, I interjected. He's so calm. He's dying, said my Russian immigrant double. I'm so sorry. No need. Now death's at everyone's door. I guess you're right. I heard you dabble in poesy. I chose to ignore his tone. I was interested in the substance of what he meant. Yes, more or less. Now more in English than in Russian. Ha! Another instance of trying to outdo Nabokov at his game, my double asked. No, a survival instinct. My audience is here. I came back. Your audience? My double turned my statement into a question. I was losing track of our coded exchange. A stalemate, I said, preparing to leave the park. Wait, please disregard my sarcasm, the Russian immigrant said. My mood is dark. My mother is 85. My dog is dying. I'm lonely. I sit in this old park and think about the virus. Yes, times are trying. We all do what we can, I said. No, wait, my double asked, his own voice defying the rules of distancing. Can you create a living record? I'm not sure what you mean. Can you describe this. This? You mean the taste of spring on our lips, the April wind? No, the pandemic. My double spoke with passion. The way we, immigrants, endure every kind of destiny's tricks, but this is too sudden. He turned his gaze downward, where in the sand the local children used to play. This is too sodden with death. Forgive the unintended pun. I think I can. Been writing in a trance. Don't stop, intoned my Russian immigrant. A mask slipped down and revealed his countenance, a feverish smile dancing on his lips. And so that's how I met my Russian immigrant double. And after that, how could I not continue? And the results are here today. And I'd like to share a few shorter poems, a couple satirical ones. This one is called Lev and Igor. And I'm sure you'll recognize the characters here. Lev and Igor, princely lions, gave some money to the Trump. I love Jews, he told them, lying. They teared up and joined his camp. Then they turned to dashing Rudy, who dispatched them to Ukraine, where a scandal was gently brooding over the end of the gravy train. Then the Trump pressured Zelensky, and Congress said, investigate. Lev and Igor were quickly linked to the emerging Ukraine gate. Poor pigeons, Lev and Igor, you've been thrown under the bus. You're in jail now, both eager to impeach your former boss. Lev and Igor, cruel fortune. A Russian immigrant mourns your fate. Politics is not your forte. Better stick to real estate. And perhaps they'll take my advice. I don't know. And then this poem was actually a result of listening to a speech at the Duma, and you will quickly recognize who was giving the speech. The poem is called Look Homeward and Recoil. I heard Ms. Tereshkova at the Duma. Her face was shiny and her perm was ironclad. The speech she gave couldn't be any dumber. I listened and I thought, boy, am I glad that we gave up this paradise of Soviet ladies who wear party suits and hate the West, who breathlessly live into their 80s like mad matryoshkas fallen out of the nest. She was the first, the glorious cosmonautka, but not the first to dress the leader's arse with kisses, though she wasn't a nutcase. Her speech was not a constitutional farce. The message was, the foreign agents send us their viruses across the airspace. We need a mighty ruler to defend us. Tsar Vladimir will shield us from disgrace. I watched the speech by Valentina Tereshkova. She looked so good. Her eyes so brutally kind. She was a perfectly post-Soviet cover for everything we immigrants left behind. And then I'm going to turn for a little while to poems that have more to do with the pandemics, and perhaps later during our conversation, I could comment on some of the Russian, specifically Russian texts and subtexts, which I later discovered. This poem is called Ode to Absurdity, and here I was in a kind of multilingual, playful mode, and this is what happened. Coronavirus crowns your lifespan. Korova virus serves your latte. Korozo virus carves your buttons. Koroho virus rolls your smokes. The Trump pretends he didn't know that viruses could be so lethal, and millions, that included Grandpa, had perished from the Spanish flu. Meanwhile, the candidates infect us with sluggishness and hopeless banter. Their videos just won't go viral. Their slogans only irritate. Our country, like a drunken cruise ship, is sailing toward the great pandemic and running out of disinfectant. and only vodka clears the soul. And I think that's how I was feeling back in April. I'm obviously feeling less pessimistic. This next poem that I'm going to read is called Go Clamming and Recite Russian Poetry. And I think readers and students of Russian poetry will recognize Pushkin's famous "Не дай мне Бог сойти с ума" in it. And this is written for my daughters, Mira and Tatiana. At low tide, I bring my daughters where the ocean meets the pond. We call this area Three Waters. Beyond it lies Nantucket Sound. We join a troop of local pickers digging the yellow sandbar. In our party-colored slickers, we look like tourists, though we are Bostonians. The virus, dreadful, has sent us running to the Cape. In Chatham, we've taken refuge. This dacha is our last escape. How long will last, God only knows. The clams lie buried in the mud. The sun is bright. The panic grows. God grant that we don't go mad. And I would also like to read another Cape Cod related poem, which has to do with an attempt at evacuation, which actually was more successful for my family than it was for my protagonist and alter ego. And this poem, Evacuation, has a subtitle, an homage to the Neil Harms, and it takes a little bit of form and inspiration from Harms's very famous poem, Из дома вышел человек. If in my Soviet childhood I'd heard this episode, I think that in all likelihood, it was utterly absurd. A Russian immigrant put his kids and wife into the car. His plan was to escape COVID. His plan was to escape COVID by moving not too far. They quickly realized their hound by accident stayed behind. They turned around and went back to Brookline. They drove across the empty fields on a desolate highway, a runaway feels the way they felt that day. Don't worry, guys, the immigrant said, cheering up his family. The Cape is safe. The Cape is safe, and the dacha will be free. State trooper stopped them at the bridge and asked them who they were. They felt on edge, but tried not to demur. Then at the supermarket where they had shopped for many years, the cashier's stare confirmed their worst fears. Around the corner from their lane, a town cop pulled them over. What brings you down? What brings you down? He asked them with a glower. Our place is here, they replied. Our taxes fund your school. They really tried to be polite. Tried hard to keep their cool. That evening, as they walked their hound, a neighbor accosted them. You bring your Boston germs around. And spread them in our town. Our immigrant wanted to transplant his family to Cape Cod. But now he worries that his plan will do them little good. He sleeps all day. He guards all night. His family and homestead. His rifle is loaded. All right. His rifle is loaded, but his heart is filled with dread. And this, by the way, harkens back to a specific time last spring when there was a petition being circulated by residents of Cape Cod, and it got a lot of signatures to close the bridges, both the Bourne Bridge and the Sagamore Bridge, a kind of isolationist local movement that we found ourselves caught in the middle of. And so I wrote this poem. Now to turn to something a bit more lyrical as opposed to just satirical, this poem is called Warding Off Despair, and I wrote it for my parents. I can't convince my parents to stay indoors and follow the quarantine. They say, don't isolate us. Touché. I can't convince my daughter, who is 14, that patience is a virtue and the world will soon recover and become pristine. I can't convince my daughter, who is 12, she is 13, by the way, now. I can't convince my daughter, who is 12, that Levin's love for Kitty is not a lie, and Vronsky's love for Anna is not a poisoned well. I can't convince myself the plague is nigh, and we should hastily evacuate to the deep country where we could survive. I can't convince my wife it's not too late to load our things into a makeshift ark and sail off toward an unknown fate. And so what's left? The pharmacy, the bank, the Russian store, takeout, Japanese, the park, the soccer field, the riverbank, the puffy clouds, the sun, the ocean breeze. I'm still alive, not down on my knees. And that too reflects a certain moment of angst, which passed a bit toward the end of the spring. And I had my light moments writing these poems. I'll read one specifically trying to reference the whole span of Soviet history. This poem is titled A Post-Soviet Guide to Coronavirus-Induced Insomnia. And I am aware of many other friends and colleagues who were experiencing bouts of insomnia, and I was not spared either. Lenin liked the Moonlight Sonata and Swiss penknives. Stalin liked plays by Bulgakov and funerals of old Bolsheviks. Khrushchev liked corn on the cob and abstract painting. Brezhnev liked young nurses and boar hunting. Andropov liked chamber theater and lawn tennis. Chernenko liked black holes and Siberian dumplings. Gorbachev liked failed empires and Louis Vuitton bags. Yeltsin liked any kind of vodka and brass bands. Putin liked pestilence and silence. And as you can see, each of these lines and each of these leaders is referenced in a more serious and a more satirical and anecdotal fashion in this specific poem. I will continue with another poem about the Soviet past, which actually in the whole book, in some sense, is the gravest and heaviest, and it has to do with sort of the last Soviet generation, the generation of those born in the mid to late 1960s, sort of the Brezhnev generation, to which I too belong, and sort of looking back at the experience of how we were educated and socialized. It's called sentimental education. Soviet women past their prime in aubergine turtlenecks washed to sheen, Vera Josephovna Perlbaum, Lyubov Leonidovna Bernstein, public detractors of Stalin, secret admirers of Pasternak, keepers of old family cooking style, cloves and garlic, celery and parsnips. Dear children, you must love the classics. They preached in voices laced with pain as our masters shot down a South Korean liner west of Sakhalin in the Sea of Japan. The English teacher, she's no dummy, spoke one classmate. Jews are usually smart. I stared out the window. Fucking Russian teacher, spoke another classmate, the sniveling Jew bitch. I smashed the window. All the world's a stage and we are merely players, repeated Vera Williamovna Perlstein. Children, drop by drop, squeeze out the slave, repeated Lyubov Antonovna Birnbaum. Outside the window, the warm-hearted playboy Brezhnev was dying. After him, the blood-thirsty spy master Andropov was dying. After him, the timid party secretary Chernenko was dying. Then Gorbachev fought for his spot under the sun of the dying. We read Lady with lapdog, we memorized Shakespeare's sonnets. We learned to love and betray one another. A whole lifetime would be enough to shake the memories of this rancorous theater. And as you may have noticed, the poem tries to play translingually on names and patronymics of famous Russian writers, but also, of course, on Shakespeare in English Soviet translations. And I'll turn to a couple of more lighter or perhaps satirical lyrical poems, one of which is called Rethinking Labor Relations. You'll understand why one had to rethink them during quarantine and self-isolation. Well, Karl Marx is probably turning or laughing in his English grave, while Leo Tolstoy is returning to his old saw. Work shall save. The cleaners don't clean at this hour of lockdown, and the handyman refused to repair our toilet and shower to replace a malfunctioning fuse. I'm constantly cleaning and fixing, and I have no time to create a new murderous manifesto or a classic of brotherly hate. Now, if there's courage to muster, and if there's a lesson to learn, when man can no longer save master, how can master save man? And I was having a little bit of fun thinking about some Marxist texts, but also some texts by Dostoevsky. And let me turn to a little snippet of a poem, which actually does not have a lot of Russianness in it, but it reflects a certain political turmoil of last spring. And it's called That Scapegoating Mayor. When a mayor scapegoats a group of his town's Jews gathered at a rabbi's funeral in the midst of a pandemic, the long history of Judophobia comes blazingly alive and haunts both the town and the whole country. And I'm sure you know that I'm referring to New York City, but this certainly had its iterations elsewhere as well. And then a really light poem, which I'll read, and then I'll conclude with a very short poem, actually a sonnet. So the light poem is called Psychoanalysis During a Pandemic, and it has two very deliberately placed epigraphs. The first one is from Tatiana's, from the episode of Eugene Onegin of Tatiana's phantasmagoric dream, where she sees Onegin in charge of that whole phantasmagoric series of events. He gives a sign and all go fussing. And the second one from Tyuchev's Silentium in Nabokov's translation, speak not, lie hidden, and conceal. A fox came by this afternoon impersonating Jacques Lacan. Or was it Jung? I wasn't sure. The fox looked Swiss and very mature. He summoned me to lie prostrate in my backyard and liberate my bound speech, to let it flow, revealing everything I know. On my back, I lay like a corpse. The fox invaded my soul. By force, it scoped me with its long red nose, while its tail formed a noose around my neck. The fox insisted, submit yourself. Don't stay clenched fisted. He tortured me and took me captive to where unconscious was collective. Stop, Dr. Fox. I am not your patient. I won't be part of your equation. I need my soul in times of crisis, when isolation drives one crazy. The fox slipped out of his frock coat, becoming an embodiment of my COVID angst, my sleepless dreams in which the I ams lose their schemes. And schemes, I suppose, both refers to the rhyme scheme and to something else. And I will conclude with a poem that is important to my personal history, to Russian history, but also to the whole history of pandemics. It's called Cholera in Crimea, and it references the late summer of 1970. Some of you remember that there was an outbreak of cholera in the south of Russia and Ukraine, which was part of the L-TOR cholera pandemic. And it started in such a way that the Soviet authorities, of course, were not announcing it properly. There was a huge panic, and my parents and I were actually vacationing outside of Sevastopol. We returned to Moscow, and my father, who is a writer and medical doctor whose field was microbiology, was very soon thereafter dispatched to Yalta with a small group of specialists who worked there at the cholera epidemic, trying to figure out how to stop it and to prevent it. So this poem came about as I remembered or reconstructed some of the things that I didn't necessarily remember. And of course, one other small bit here is I suppose, am thinking of the end of Sholem Aleichem's Tevye, where the famous anecdote about cholera in Odessa comes up, right? Let's talk about something more fun. What's the news of cholera in Odessa? So this is not cholera in Odessa, but cholera in Crimea. I don't remember the epidemic, just the panic. August 1970, Sebastopol, the smell of rotting apricots, my mother's dainty tunic, Ukchuyevka beach, the cotton heat, the groundswell of fear, seething lines at the ticket office, vacationists like wartime evacuees, the talk of spreading illness, words like orifice or dehydration hanging in the breeze, the hasty packing, my collection of stag beetles forgotten on the windowsill, our train arriving at Kursk station, empty bottles, my parents kissing on the platform, reunion. I didn't know another parting was near. My father, a doctor, would be dispatched to Crimea. So there you have you. I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for being with us, and we're happy to take some questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Professor Kan. Sergei, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Maxim. Poetry read out loud by the author is a very different experience than just reading it on a printed page. So we have some questions from the audience. The first question is, were you writing these poems more for yourself to process, or more for your potential reader to help them process the politics and the pandemics of this age? Or was it a bit of both?
It's a very, very good question. And I think this truly began as a spontaneous outpouring of feelings, very much along the lines of how, for instance, Wordsworth would speak of poetry as inspirational and spontaneous, and also as an attempt to ward off some of my worst fears. I did not think at all initially, back at the end of last year, that this would be a cycle or a future collection of poems, and especially because if you know about my personal development, I came to the United States as a 20-year-old, as a young Russian language poet who was very bent on cultivating my literary Russianness. And while I quickly transitioned to writing fiction and nonfiction in English, I had really held on tight to the Russianness of my poetry. And even, although I had occasionally published a poem in English or two, usually for a special issue or occasion, but really, this was the first time that I found myself steadily writing poetry in English. So initially, I did not think of an audience and of it being a book, but eventually I started thinking about it. So that's the brief answer. So thank you for your question.
Related question here. When you write, do you process your thoughts in English, Russian, or both? how do you balance the benefits and the barriers of both languages?
It's very interesting. And I really think it varies. However, in this case, usually these poems, that's how they came to me. I truly did not force myself or force them upon myself. In a sense, this probably is what it means to live a translingual life, because the point here is that we don't live simultaneously or even consecutively in two different languages, say Russian and English. I think the sense is that we live betwixt and between, as Robert Frost put it in his famous poem, Peril of Hope. It's right in there, betwixt and between. I truly feel this way more and more now. And so thoughts come in various shapes, and sometimes they're not verbalized. But for me personally, the composition of these poems was an experience of living in the English language, but translingually, which is also why some of them are in conversation with Russian poets, Russian history, and my Soviet past.
Okay. Another question, how do you think your quarantine writing processes might compare to those of your father during the Russian pandemic you mentioned? How does the clam catching poem relate to "Не дай мне Бог сойти с ума"? So there are really two questions here.
Oh, okay. So
what about your dad? And
those are very interesting questions. Well, first of all, I would never compare myself to my father and to his experiences. He's a far greater writer and far superior stylist and craftsman. And so I don't think we want to go there, except I've already said he's my principal teacher, except I didn't learn very well. And also, unlike my father, I never lived through excruciating experiences of leaving the siege of Leningrad as a child, of growing up, graduating from high school in 1953, almost at the peak of Stalinist anti-Semitic paranoia, and of course of being a refusing activist. So this is not a particularly productive direction, as far as I am concerned, of thinking myself vis-a-vis my father. This poem specifically is an attempt to show that for me, this is a reconstruction and to a small degree a remembrance. Whereas for my father, cholera was a dangerous experience where he risked his life for Russia and her citizens. Now, the question about how the clamming poem relates to Pushkin, well, because it takes its meter and because its last line is a more or less literal translation of "Не дай мне Бог сойти с ума," God grant that we don't go mad. So I guess that's how.
All right. And here's another question. Have you felt more or less productive during the lockdown as a writer? Do you find that frustrations about current events end up being seeds of innovation?
It's a very interesting question. You know, I actually recently had the opportunity to reflect on it in a more sort of deliberate fashion. I wrote a little piece that ran in the Los Angeles Review of Books, specifically trying to figure out what this experience was like and what my creative laboratory was like. Of course, it is difficult not to think about the beneficence of these experiences if you produce something, but would I give up this whole book in a heartbeat for not having had to live through it? Yes, absolutely, I would. And I really speak my heart and my mind when I say that. Now, the book was brought to life by extreme political and epidemiological circumstances. Of course, this is true. And so to go back to an earlier question, but also to speak a little bit to this one, was this my method of survival? To some degree, yes, I think it was. And it was also, I think, a way of proving to myself that poetry can offer a modicum of faith, perhaps a small dose of relief. So what I mean by that is, I think it's difficult to write poetry today without harboring hope that our lines, our verses, our silly rhymes would lead one out of the labyrinth of this political aggression illness and despair. And so for that part, I think, grateful, but the results are for you to judge.
We don't seem to have any more questions from the audience. Maybe we will in a minute or two. In the meantime, I have just a thought that came to mind, and then a question for Maxim as well. And the thought is, again, going back to Pushkin in Boldina and in the cholera quarantine. And then I'm sure you remember a wonderful poem by David Samoilov about Pushkin in that place and time, and in the wonderful last line, "Благодарение Богу ты свободен, Россия в Болдине, в карантине." And it just occurred to me how poetry, especially I think Russian poetry, but maybe not exclusively, is a conversation with one's predecessors and ancestors, much greater than we are, but still. It's an ongoing conversation, and that I find very interesting in your poetry, which is in English. It's very American, place-based, in being very well acquainted with the places of Beacon Street and Brookline and Cape Cod. You know, we can identify with those things, but underneath there is a kind of a plus, a layer of various allusions to Russian poetry, to other poets, and other events in Russian history, both national and personal. So I find that very, very interesting. And I know you've added footnotes to your poetry book for your, I guess, more for your American reader, English language reader, to understand all the hints and allusions. So that is another interesting dimension of the poetry. My question is this book a sign of Maxim Shrayer becoming an English language poet, or is there still room in your poetic quiver, so to speak, for Russian language poetry?
Thank you, Sergei. First of all, thank you for your comment, and I can hear the beautiful way in which you read Russian poetry just from the two lines you read by David Samoilov. The question of footnotes, they're not so much footnotes. They're two things I did. One of them, this was the suggestion of my wife, Karen, Dr. Karen Lasser, who was, I think, the first reader of this whole book. She basically felt that I should add notes in the back of the book, which would explain some of the Russian references. And I did. I was initially reluctant, but I'm very glad I did, and I had my fun with it. The other is, and I think this is probably the most direct homage to Nabokov. Remember, in the prologue I read, the fellow Russian immigrant basically says to him, another instance of trying to outdo Nabokov. So what I did do is I added a kind of mock index, which is both serious and not, but it's quite detailed, and it references various names and places in the book, but also various implied and remembered or forgotten places that have to do with the book. So there I have these notes and the index. Now, the question that you asked about composing in English, it's a new experience of poetry, composing poetry, because I had been translating poetry, Russian poetry, for many, many years, and I feel very committed to this task, but it's a different task. I have written a few new poems in English since Biden's victory, and these poems are, I guess, at the moment, a reflection on sort of the political afterlife of the sitting president and how the American landscape has changed. I am not entirely sure what's going to happen to that. Now, the question about writing in Russian, and here a couple of things have happened. One is, since this book became a book, I have been asked to contribute some poems, one project specifically dealing with coronavirus in Russian poetry, and another publication. And I did two things. One is I've translated several poems as closely as I could into Russian, but I also started writing a whole new cycle of Russian language poems, which are really separate from this collection, and there are about maybe 20 of them. So we'll see. A few have come out, but others have not. And if, Sergei, you don't mind, just to humor you, let me read my own translation in Russian of that poem about insomnia. So remember, basically, the idea there is the Jewish Russian immigrant is having insomnia during coronavirus, and he's sort of reciting names of Russian leaders with various associations. So this I translated as literally as I could, and this came out in a project called Coronaverse, which is run by Gennady and Rika Katsov in New York. So this is called «Русский иммигрант сражается с коронавирусной бессонницей. Ленин любил лунную сонату и швейцарские карманные ножики. Сталин любил пьесы Булгакова и похороны старых большевиков. Хрущев любил кукурузные початки и абстрактную живопись. Брежнев любил молоденьких медсестер и охоту на вепрей. Андропов любил камерные театры и теннис на лужайке. Черненко любил черные дыры и сибирские пельмени. Горбачев любил распад империй и сумки от Луи Виттона. Ельцин любил любую водку и духовые оркестры. Путин любил пандемии и молчание поэтов. So basically, there you have it, and I had fun thinking about it.
So it sounds like there is still going to be a Russian poet, Maxim Shrayer.
Perhaps
Down the road.
Perhaps let's not write him off yet.
Another question from the audience coming. How much of your inspiration as a writer comes from Russian literature, American writing, and culture? Is there a place in these traditions where you feel most at home?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And let me try to answer it precisely and analytically when it comes to this book. So I think principally, and this is reflected in the three epigraphs that I have to the whole book. One comes from one of my favorite Russian poets, of whom I wrote a book and whom I've translated, Sylvinsky, from his anecdotes about the Karaite philosopher Babakai Suduk, which is a famous aphorism, «Лучше недо, чем пере», better to under than to over. And that tells you that it's not just any Russian poetry. I think was particularly influenced by the early Soviet pre-war decades, which was a very high moment in Russian poetry. The next epigraph actually comes from Carl Sandburg, from his The Long Shadow of Lincoln Litany, and it's sing low, sing high, sing wide, make your wit a guard and cover, let your laughter come free, like a help and a brace of comfort. And I truly found a lot of comfort and also a lot of inspiration in these words, but also it comes from a particular moment in American modernist poetry. And the last epigraph is from Fernando Pessoa, the great Portuguese poet who, of course, is famous for his heteronyms. In other words, he created literary identities, separate literary identities of poets that functioned almost autonomously. And one of them is called Alvaro de Campos, and I'm going to massacre the Portuguese, but I'll read it for you because you will see why it was so important to me. Depois a máscara, tornei a pola, assim é melhor, assim sou a máscara. And this is, I took off. So basically, he had a mask, and then he says, I took off the mask and put it back on, right? This way is better. This way I am the mask. So basically here, what particularly inspired me is the idea that a literary identity or a literary voice is like a mask. And thinking about it during the pandemic worked both literally and figuratively, right? So there's your brief answer. And thank you. What is a wonderful question.
Okay, one more question. How do you think you might feel to read someone else's translation of your poetry? Have you had this experience yet?
It's a very interesting question. I have, to a limited degree, more with prose and with fiction and nonfiction. With poetry, a few cases. And, you know, I'm going to say something which is not meant to be really controversial, but I think there are some benefits to the sanctity and safety of monolingualism, because I've had to participate in the experience of working with translators who translated into the languages that I know. And it's a difficult experience in a sense, you know, when I had, say, a book published in Mandarin, and when I couldn't find my name on the cover, and I had to ask my daughters, who have been students of Mandarin since kindergarten, where Maxim Shrayer is on the cover, you know, there was something to it, because I had no idea. I could not form an opinion. At the same time, you know, I was looking at German translations, and basically I liked them, but there were things I would have done differently. So I do not know what to tell you. The only place where I feel I'm in the position to judge is between Russian and English, because those are my homes, true homes.
I think we've exhausted. Oh no, there is more. How do you think you might feel? Oh no, another question. Где можно прочесть эти 36 стихотворений? Where can we read these 36 questions?
Замечательный вопрос.
36 poems.
Yes, thank you for your question. Well, basically, at this point, the 36 can only be read in the book, which exists both in print and as an ebook in English. And I very deliberately did not submit them elsewhere, because there was, I wanted sort of the book to come out a little bit like Aphrodite out of, you know, the sea foam. The Russian language translations have appeared in 2 publications so far. Now, I've been asked whether this will ever become a full Russian language book, and I really do not know. Probably someone else would have to take on that task and perhaps collaborate with me. So, я прошу прощения, но лучшего ответа я не могу предложить.
I might add a very handsome little book, and the photograph on the cover is very lyrical, so it does create the kind of mood.
Well, it's basically, the photograph on the cover is a photograph that I took, and it's based on this experience that I describe in the prologue of observing this mysterious immigrant with a dying Newfoundland.
Yeah, I think we've sort of reached the end of our afternoon encounter with Maxim Shrayer. I just want to add that listening to you read and talk about being bilingual and bicultural as a writer, as a teacher, I can't help thinking, I give our immigrant generation a kind of a pat on the back, that I think poets and scholars like yourself and many others who've come out of former Soviet Union, we have contributed to the culture of both American and Russian, and I personally find being bilingual, bicultural like yourself, a gratifying experience. It enriches what we do, whether it's in the classroom or in the research and writing, or in more personal, poetic and literary forms. So I want to encourage you to continue working in both languages. I think that would be the optimal scenario, and hopefully you'll write poetry about things that are not related to our miserable politics or pandemics, but something else.
Thank you so much, Sergei.
It was a pleasure spending time with you, Maxim.
Likewise. Thank you, and thank you all.
Goodbye.